So, I've got this little exchange between made by Jimbob and a viewer, Dr. Deino, where Jimbob basically gives him a line of questioning challenging evolution. Now, it seems like the viewer was kind of unprepared for this, and I don't want to be too hard on him. After all, I have the benefit of not having to do this live, but nevertheless, we're going to go over a selection of Jimbob's questions and hopefully handle them in a little bit more of an articulate and correct way. The debate starts off with each side defining evolution, which is a good start, so I'll do the same. I want to preface it by giving Jim Bob some leniency since he hasn't yet heard my case for evolution, and so obviously he won't address it at any point in the clips I'm including, but I will refer to my definition in my arguments, so here it goes. In my view, evolution is a mathematically necessary consequence of four primary conditions within a system. Premise 1. Individuals in the population are unequal to each other. Let's call this variance. Okay. Premise 2. Traits are passed down vertically between generations. Let's call this inheritance. Premise 3. More individuals are born than can be sustained. So, in other words, there is an unequal distribution of resources. We'll call this competition. And premise 4. Some traits are more favorable for sustainability than others, and will therefore tend to replicate more often, and we'll call this selection. Mutations are an honorable mention which contribute to premise 1, variation, and which are an integral part of biological evolution, but are not a necessary precondition for a system to be termed an evolutionary one. All of these conditions are observed in biology and suffice to account for so-called microevolution. But let's take it further, because this model can make predictions too. Suppose we find a population which meets the four conditions and has mutations. We know necessarily then that the population must have been different in the past. Wait, before you object. And note that this does not mean that we can a priori ascertain how long this evolution has been occurring for, or the degree of change which has occurred. We can, however, ascertain a priori that the duration of evolution is equal to the duration that the four conditions have been present in the population. This means that the process of microevolution is an integral and inexorable part of the existence of the population. Again, we don't know a priori how old the populations are or how much they have changed, just that they have been evolving from the moment of their genesis, and that at genesis they differed in some way from the present, however micro or macro these differences may be. And furthermore, we have some equally important scenarios which cannot be ascertained a priori. For example, none of these conditions impose a limit on the number of variants in a population, nor on the number of modifications which can be accrued between the moment of genesis and an arbitrary future date. You also cannot have a change of kinds because that breaks a line of inheritance. The challenge for Jim Bob is to demonstrate at least one of three things. He can demonstrate that the definition and the logical implications of evolution are incoherent on their own terms. This is different from another option, which is to demonstrate that any of the four premises are contradictory to nature or even entirely absent from it. And his third option is to propose a fifth condition, which exists in nature and it imposes the limitations which could not be deduced from the original four alone. While he thinks about that, and I hope he sees this, let's get to the video.
Can you describe what it is you're saying occurs?
I can give you my definition. Although,
Okay.
sorry, another question I was going to ask was what would your definition be? Would you mind giving yours first, and then I can give mine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the current definition that I've seen is changes in allele frequency over time.
That is one way to describe it.
Is
I
that
would
the only
define.
way, or
Oh, good.
I was going to say, what else would you
It's
add to it from your view?
so the way I would describe it is I would describe evolution as change in a population of organisms
Mm-hmm.
over successive generations.
I like how his definition is just a reframing of changing allele frequency over time. Like, I don't really see why he needed to reframe it. It doesn't really add anything.
These
Okay,
changes
that
can be genetic, physical,
okay,
behavioral, etc.
okay, cool. So would you say populations themselves would be an effect of your description?
Well, you do need a starting population, correct?
Okay.
A population is just a group that satisfies my four premises. They quibble about populations for a little bit here, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip ahead. I've already given my definition of populations, and we're going to try to actually answer some more of Jim Bob's questions.
Understanding the environment in that way isn't a function of a larger brain, which we're at the tail end of the process of its creation, right? Wouldn't it wouldn't it be necessarily true that every version pre early ape, early chimp that was on its way to becoming a human being would almost need to innately have an understanding, reflexively understanding of the environment, not like conceptual understanding, just an innate, direct. I'm leaving. Direct.
To put this into context, he just got done with a line of questioning about how humans use their brains to gather information about the world, and how the implication is that this is a lot more work than simply genetically, innately knowing like which food or poisonous stuff to avoid and what is good. Like humans have to learn this throughout their life using their brain. And so the question is, why, if in the past, animals had these innate abilities of knowing what to avoid and what is good for them, and humans, since those animals were ancestral to humans, why would humans lose this ability in favor of having these big brains, which take a lot more work to actually do? The answer is, of course, we have much instinctual knowledge, as it's referred to here. If I encounter a pile of shit, nearly all of my senses are innately disgusted by it, and I don't have to be taught to not eat it. The same is true if I find rancid meat, for example. The question is about a very specific intuition, knowing what berries are good, which there's no reason to assume is a remnant from our past that we've lost. Dr. Dino should have known that he doesn't have to grant this premise at all. How do humans know what food is good and where to find it? The basis for this in human societies is actually tradition. The food that was good when your parents fed it to you is still good when you're an adult, and it's still good when you feed it to your own children. Rinse and repeat. In fact, we don't even have to start with humans to see tradition in effect. Chimps do not innately have this knowledge either. Juvenile chimps learn by copying the adults. Monkey see, monkey do. So not only is it not a given that humans used to have some berry picking instinct that we lost, we have non human examples of species whose diet is based in tradition. Now, I understand that Jimbob will want to pass the question further down. How does the chimp learn tradition? Why wouldn't it be better to simply have innate knowledge instead of tradition? But let's evaluate the question that was originally asked first. He granted the existence of humans, and he even granted some prior line of succession. And the reason he did this, of course, is because his line of questioning implies he believes it is incoherent to have an evolutionary line of humans who do not possess innate berry picking abilities. But I ask you, before we pass the question further, did I answer the original question coherently?
Well, I'm saying, well, if there was a version of that animal that was, go back far enough and they're asexual, everything's in house. They didn't need the parenting. They didn't need to risk their existence to go find a mate and do like a little song and dance and fluff your feathers to get the chick excited, right? To win her over. You didn't have to worry about another animal, another male killing you in some sort of battle over the female. You just have everything in house. And the reason I asked you, would it be more beneficial for an organism to not need a parent? I'm not arguing that just inside of populations of male and female. I'm saying any organism, wouldn't it benefit them to not need a parent? And you didn't tell me how that's not necessarily true. It seems.
I've watched a few of Jim Bob's recent debates now, and one of his favorite questions is about the evolution of sexual reproduction. The question here is, wouldn't it be better to not need to find a sex partner? If you can do everything by yourself, that sure seems like a lot less work, right? Now, as with the last question, I need to analyze what precisely is being asked by the question itself. First, there's the question of the efficacy of it. That is, how does sex benefit an organism that doesn't need to do it? Another question is how the transition from asexuality is mechanically possible in a gradualistic context. The question being asked is the former, and so that is the question I'll answer. I'm happy to answer the mechanical question on stream sometime, but my challenge to Jim Bob here is to explain how the answer to his question is incoherent, and not how it fails to answer an entirely different question. And I'll actually start by making the problem of sex more confounding than even Jim Bob gives it credit for. If indeed we define adaptation as a benefit to the individual, then sex is actually devastating. Not only is it more difficult to do than to simply replicate on your own, but even if it is successful, the individual forfeits half of its genes to another one. It's a terrible deal, really. So we're left with the double problem of explaining why selection would force you to sacrifice half of your genes and to find a partner to do it. Let's explain why Jim Bob's interlocutors are wrong to suggest that natural selection keeps around those traits which somehow subjectively benefit the individual. This is a false notion, as explained by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. The genes are selfish because selection occurs at the level of the gene, not the individual. And there are many cases in which the imperative of a gene to replicate is not conducive to what might actually subjectively benefit the individual. For example, there are male wasps who are born asexually, and their only act in life is to walk to the unfertilized female eggs in the nest, fertilize them with sperm, then immediately die. You might say the male wasp has an imperative which supersedes its own survival. When thinking about sex from the perspective of natural selection, we need to discard subjective notions of benefit to the individual and think about what sex actually does to be selected. Sex radically recombines the genes of a population, thereby rapidly increasing variance compared to asexual reproduction. There's that word from premise one again, variance. Individuals have no choice over their genotype. They do not get to evaluate whether sex is good for them. They simply either do it or perish. The genes themselves have an inherent imperative to replicate, and paradoxically, variance correlates with resilience to the environment. When a resilient sexual individual reproduces, its offspring are again condemned to the same choice, do it or perish. It's a vicious cycle where the most viable offspring are the very same ones which must choose between forfeiting all of their genes or only 50%. Whereupon, if they do, the sexual trait remains. It's a feedback loop. Again, this suffices to explain why this mode of reproduction is sustainable and not the entirely different question of how a transition into it is mechanically possible. Okay, in this next part, Jim Bob is going to stipulate what, for some reason, is the most amusing hypothetical I've ever heard, which is none other than Camel World. Camel World is a rhetorical charge flanking Dr. Dino's position on transitional fossils. But seriously, before Jim Bob explains it himself, I need to get in a word on the fossil record itself. The fossil record really only corroborates evolution, but it doesn't suffice on its own to demonstrate transition. The only relevant features of the fossil record to this debate are that fossils appear in the order that phylogeny would predict, even without pre existing fossil data. And the fossils we do have do neatly fit into the phylogenetic tree without inconsistency. It's an interesting corroboration, but it doesn't really suffice as an argument for evolution or a transition. And there are stronger arguments anyway, so I tend to not make an issue of it in these debates. I actually think Camel World truly has potential as a staple of this debate, though. So let's hear Jim Bob out.
So if there was a if the world was filled with camels, right? And you were like, "Hey, I'm Dr. Dino. I'm studying animals, and I have this hunch that there was a previous form of a camel, right? Previous form that morphed over time. And if I find the fossil, I just need to find this fossil that kind of looks like it, but it's not exactly. And the camel is the only version of a camel looking thing you ever knew. And lo and behold, you dig and you find like a llama or something, right? Right, and you celebrate. And, you know, the scientific world gives you money and a lanyard, and you get to write an article and get interviewed by Neil Tyson to DeGrasse Tyson or whatever. Okay, so Well, you celebrate and you go, I found this transitional fossil, and the whole world celebrates. But lo and behold, this unvisited place in Peru, let's say, some farmers digging, and they dig up uh, the same fossil, and they go, hey, look, oh, come over here, look at this. And then the chief leader or whatever in the small Peruvian village goes, wow, you found a llama. That's interesting. Now you notice the difference is that the Peruvian tribe knows a llama exists, right? And you don't. And so from their paradigm, they found a llama. From your paradigm, you found a transitional fossil.
All right, so the world is filled with camels. That's freaking epic. But okay, so if we try to construe Camel World into a hypothetical that we can take seriously, we see that he's posing a world with limited data. So you're a zoologist who's really only familiar with camels, but you've got this phylogenetic tree with gaps in it where the transitional camel should be. And because you're Dr. Dino, you assume it must be there and you simply haven't found it yet. Then, lo and behold, a fossil does turn up. Your confirmation bias tells you it's the transitional form you've been looking for. But really, the locals know that it's just a llama and the resemblance is pure coincidence. I actually think there is an important question and also an implied claim to be derived from this. The implied claim is that what makes a transitional fossil is a matter of perspective. This is why Camel World has a low data environment. When you step outside the hypothetical and see the full picture, you see that Dr. Dino, the hypothetical scientist, has a biased perspective. The question is, how can we ever be justified in determining something is transitional rather than coincidence?
So if there was a if the world was filled with camels, right? And you were like, hey, I'm Dr. Dino, I'm studying animals, and I have this hunch that there was a previous form of a camel, right? Previous form that morphed over time.
Right, so we return to Camel World fresh out of our lesson in biases. And this time, we just want to take advantage of this abundance of camels to do our zoology work. You go to the first camel and you're doing all this charting of its features, and then you do the same for another one, and pretty soon you get pretty used to these camels, so you start giving them names because you can recognize all of them just by looking at them. You observe the different stages of their life cycle, and you can tell the babies have the same distinctive features that you charted for their parents. But Camel World is not without its harsh realities. The camel infant mortality rate is high. Resources need to be rationed to deliver precious milk to the healthiest babies. When you go over your notes to compile your research into a book, four words repeatedly stick out: variance, inheritance, competition, and selection. Aha, you go. Camel World is an evolutionary system. Recall when I said fossil data corroborates phylogeny, but it doesn't demonstrate it on its own? The Camel World hypothetical can impose all sorts of limits on the scientist's access to data. It can take away the fossil world. It can even heavily imply that a world filled with fucking camels might have always been that way. And yet it still doesn't violate the four premises. Its lesson about bias doesn't explain how evolution is incoherent. And most damning of all, it doesn't even impose that fifth condition that renders evolution impossible. The last thing I want to do is end this the same way the debate ended. Jimbob actually asked a very good question, which is for a Steelman explanation of his position. And Dr. Dino sadly gives an NPC response. So let's see his attempt and then I'll give it a try.
Um, could you do me a favor and try to gather everything you heard from me and try to steel man me the most charitable possible way you could?
In regards to,
The whole position that I'm countering from.
you don't believe that evolution occurs or that deep time exists because you believe that there are flaws in our scientific understanding that are better explained by, I'm I believe you're a Christian, correct? So I would probably
Okay.
say the
So,
Bible.
okay. When in this entire conversation did I appeal to the Bible?
You have not in this conversation.
Okay. So that is that a steel
I am
man then?
basing what I just said on other
Oh, so you
things
can't
I have
steel man.
heard you
I
say.
gotcha.
Yeah, I find it incredible he doesn't understand Jim Bob's line of questioning. Jim Bob's position is very clearly questioning how we can have knowledge of the relatedness of the species, of how we can have knowledge of which traits are somehow beneficial on an objective basis. I didn't answer nearly all of Jim Bob's questions from this debate, and I certainly didn't flesh out a completed evolutionary worldview, but I made a point to demonstrate that the coherence of my answers is not contingent on whatever the follow up question may be. I think this is important because although he asks a lot of questions, behind them is this implied position that evolution is logically incoherent. In fact, I would say the vast majority of the arguments against evolution are non empirical and instead focus on the question of coherence. And that's why he confidently makes these concessions when he sets up his questions. He's not asking for a list of taxonomic categories or all the data. He's asking for coherence. I'd like to know if he would concede that I have given a coherent account of this selection of questions, and not just concede it for the sake of argument, but actually agree. Again, I hope he sees this.